We'll try to understand domain name system in this lesson. Maybe people who are aware of the DNS concepts, maybe they can skip this session. There's going to be very fundamental and high level understanding of the DNS system before we discuss the Azure DNS services. So maybe people who are not much familiar with the DNS applications or DNS services, how and what is that? Maybe they can just go through this particular lesson. Right. So we use something called a DNS domain name system. Most of the times, the systems or network people might be talking about this word called as a DNS, but maybe the developers or the other users may not be aware of this terminology called as a DNS, but primarily who are working in the systems areas and network area, they will be very familiar with this word called as a DNS. So on a daily basis, we access the applications or basically the websites or banking or something with something like an example. I'm just giving it like an www.google.com. We're giving www.microsoft.com. Again, www. You can say called as an oracle.com, like etc. 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 What we see called as an. Now, what are these things actually? How do they basically work? What exactly happens? Now we see www.google.com. So when I use a browser and type google.com, basically it gives me some application. Similarly, when I type www.oracle.com, it gives me some content or a type basically, or an application. But in the background, what exactly, how this has been organized and what exactly happens over here. Now, there are two things. One is so we call public DNS names or private DNS names. We'll understand as we go on what makes the difference between a public DNS name and a private DNS name. So on the internet, so we use called as a dot, which is called as a root. This we called as a starting of a domain name or a start of the domain name, or we called as a root. Okay. So basically the internet is the starting point of any particular domain. So we use www.google.com or microsoft.com or basically oracle.in or yahoo.in or some. There are so many things which are basically like things which comes in. But we don't really read this dot, but this is the starting point of any kind of a domain and name. So we know most of the times we call domain names, but this isn't. So under this particular starting of the domain name, there is something called as an top level domains. Top level domains. So we call .com, like in .net, like in .in. This is what we call them as a top level domains. Top level domains. So these are basically controlled by their internet. So this basically gives the like a separation of some kind of for what purpose you're basically going to register your domain or anything. Now this is basically earlier in the initial stages of the domain evolution or something called as a starting point of the domains. These are used to be called as basically a differentiation. Like in a .com means a commercial applications. .net means basically the ISP provided or network organizations. Like a .in or .us, like there are country specific. So basically, to identify themselves, basically the organizations or anybody within this world, they basically choose the top level domain names, top level domain. So under which their domain need to be registered or something, which we call as the top level domains. Now under this, then we would see something called as an actual domain name, like in, I would say Google, like in Microsoft, like in Acute-Learn. These are, we would see this is basically a domain now. So which is under the top level domain. Now this falls under basically a top level domain, sorry, under the top level domains. On this we call it as an, this can represent your basically an individual person, or it could be an organization, or could be some kind of an applications or platforms, or a platforms purposes. Now, so this identifies individual person. Maybe let's say I want to have my own domain name. I can purchase it like a ramana.com or a ramana.net or ramana. Something, whatever is just being available under the top level domains. Or organization can have their own name under this particular top level domains, like as Google, we see Google, we see Microsoft.com, like a Microsoft.in, like an Acute-Learn.in or something like that. And we would see could be an applications, what we see called as in a banking applications or some other applications. We see platforms like a Zoom or some kind of like a platforms like a GoToMeeting or some lot of other things which they basically have the names representing their applications in this form of it. So when we want to own a specific domain, so we need to choose under which top level domain we want it. And we verify whether this domain is existing or someone else has been registered. So we have domain registers like GoDaddy, Net4 India, network hosting provider. Like there are so many vendors across the globe who are available who can register the domains, okay, under the top level domains. So we call them as a domain register. So we go to the domain register and we say that we need a domain called as in heyramana.com. Can you please register? If nobody has taken it so far, then basically it is available for registration, and we basically own that particular domain and we keep renewing it on a yearly basis. Now, when we read it, so when we read it like in a google.in, google.com, google. We don't really read the root. So whenever we are basically telling someone else, hey, I own a domain called as a ramana.in. So I only say ramana.in, but I don't read out or write the starting point of the domain name, that is a dot. Now under this, you would see something called as an like www, like an login, like basically called as in photos, something like this, which we would see many things which is basically like this. Now these are basically under a domain name which represents your applications. Now this represents could be an application or a purpose of an application, or basically the usage of the application to the world. So we see www.google.com. Now, typically www represents basically the purpose and an application or a purpose of an application or usage of the application. Based on that, we do that. Now, this is something which can be controlled by us. So when we read out, we call this in www.google.com, like in a login.microsoft.com, like in photos.google.com, like in, I would say called this in training.acutelearn.in, like something which we basically read it. Now, when we read it, so we read from the bottom to the top where we see called as in the application, or basically the purpose of the application, or the server, which we can see also call it as in the basically a server on which the application is being hosted, dot the domain which is being registered, which is representing the individual or organizations or an application or something basically under the top level a domain name. So when we read it as basically called as an a www dot something like a google.com, which is called as an fully qualified domain name. So if you ask this particular someone in the system, they use something called as a fully qualified domain name. So we use a terminology called as a fully qualified domain name. So this represents a server on an internet, an application on the internet, or some kind of a resource on the internet. So when we want to interact with a server or a resource or something, so that particular server or a resource should have an FQDN name. So anything which needs to be accessible over the internet, and if you want to promote yourself or promote your organization or basically provide an access to the applications to the external users, to customers, everything, we need to have something called as a fully qualified domain name. Now, this could be a public domain. Now, so .com, .net, .in, like .us is something which we see called as the top level domains. They are being controlled. Today, we see a lot of things like in AI, like a lot of many things which are coming up. Okay. The internet has basically released a lot of top level domains. Okay, initially they were basically 10 to 12. Later they came up with country based, and now they've opened with many things. Like I can have something called as an acutelearn.training. Training. So they've opened up like these kind of things, which we would see that kind of things. So this is basically what we called as a fully qualified domain name now. Now, what is how this works now? Now, when you go to the www.google.com, when I say ping www.google.com, I see something called as an IP address is coming up. So when I say ping www.acutelearn.com, I see that there is some IP address is coming up. Now, what is this basically, and how this works basically? Now, one portion of this is in we see called as in the first step, what we do called as in the step one, which we called as in registration or procuring a domain name under the top level domain. So we purchase this registration of procuring a domain. So let's say if I procure a domain under .in, so I would say called as, and I'm calling it as an acutelearn.in. .in is my this things. Acutelearn.in. Like these things, we procure this particular one. So first we need to own a domain, which is going to be a public. So if you want to showcase yourself or your organization or applications to the external world outside of your organization, then we need to have a public domain be registered with some kind of a GoDaddy or something else. Now, two organizations or two individuals or someone cannot own the same domain. If someone else already purchased the domain called as an acutelearn.in, then I cannot procure it. So I have to choose a different. So only one particular an organization, someone can own this particular domain across the globe. Okay, so which includes the domain dot top level domain name, these things now. Now, once we procure it now we use something called as an applications, accessibility, and everything. Now I have an application deployed in the server. some kind of an application. Now I want to provide access to the users. Now there are two things which is required now. So any resource. Now you have basically a server with application, web application. Some kind of an application is being developed. Now you want to provide this application to the external users. Now this is an application. This is a server which is running maybe Windows Server 2019. This is a Windows Server 2019 which is basically running. And running some kind of an IIS web application. IIS web application. This web application. Now I want to provide this application access to my customers or someone else. What is required now? Now, two questions here now. Does this application need to be accessible only from within the private network or within the organization? Or does this application need to be accessible over the internet? So always we should have two questions now. One is, hey, does this application is accessible outside of your corporate network or to the public or to the internet? Or it should be accessible only within the organization network. Now, any application which needs to be accessible over the internet needs a public IP address. Needs a public IP address. So any application or basically any server or an application which needs to be accessible over the internet needs a public IP address. So if building a server is not enough, right? If I want that application to be accessible over the internet, I need a public IP address. Now, if you are creating servers in Azure will provide a public IP address. If you're creating a server in AWS will provide a public IP address. If you're basically having your own servers in your own data center, then your internet service provider is going to provide a public IP addresses, right? Purely basically the internet service providers will own the public IP addresses and they allocate the public IP addresses. Now we need a public IP address which is being provided by an internet service provider in order to provide access to the application over the internet. So now what is the problem with an IP address? Now I cannot tell everybody that my IP is 10.20.30. Something like that, and which is hard to remember. Now we are basically known to remember with the names. Okay, so each and every person basically has a name, and we are known basically habituated to use the names for accessing or communicating over this thing. Now what happens now in the computer networking? We are using something on IP addresses, but which is hard to remember and which is very difficult to share this one with external users, right? These things. Now what is required now? So that's where we would see called as the another one which is called as hey, we can have basically a DNS, a name, a DNS, an FQDN name given to a server or an application. Now, if this application needs to be accessible over the internet, now we can have a public FQDN name. And if this application needs to be accessible only within a private network, then we can have an FQDN name. Now, the customers are basically the users can use two methods to interact with the application, which is hosted on a server. Either they can use the public IP address or they can use the FQDN name. Now, these are two different sections. One is an IP address is a different one. An FQDN name is something different. Now, IP address is being provided by an internet service provider. An FQDN name is being provided by the domain register. Domain register. So the IP address, public IP address, is basically routable or reachable on the internet. So we can reach, that is the IP address of the server on a internet. Now, how does this basically happening here now? Now, when I type www.google.com, it is resolving to a public IP address, and the request is being forwarded to this one. Now, when I say here, a ping www.acutelearn.com, it is giving me some IP address. Now, this is the public IP address of the server, which is hosting an application called www.acutelearn.com, which is a fully qualified domain name. Now, how does this mapping of an FQDN name to an IP address is happening? Because IP address is being provided by Microsoft or someone else, ISP. My domain is being purchased from somewhere else. But where are we basically mapping these things? How this works? How this works? That is where we use applications called as DNS applications. DNS applications. So there are applications like a DNS application, maybe which is available on Windows operating system, Linux operating system, Solaris. Like on many operating systems, we have this application called as a DNS application. So we use a terminology called as a name servers or a DNS servers. DNS servers. Typically, when we are interacting with external people, something they call, hey, what is the DNS server of your domain or a name server of your domain? Now, the name server or DNS server is basically nothing but an IP address, or basically a server with an IP address running a DNS application for your domain, So when I register a domain with a domain register for an external domains, for each and every domain, the domain register will maintain the DNS information. So they'll have the DNS servers, which basically maintains the domain information. Now, what are these DNS servers applications will do? Now, these DNS servers or DNS application will maintain the FQDN details, what we call as the host details for a specific domain, and will maintain the IP address of the FQDN. Now, these DNS applications maintains something called as a DNS, what we call as a records. DNS records. So these DNS records are basically nothing but maintains information about FQDN. Now, in a simple terminology, so I have this Windows some server. So I installed a server with a public IP address called as a 15.6.4.41, a public IP, and it has a DNS application installed. So this DNS application will maintain called as a DNS records. So we maintains an information for a domain like an acutelearn.com, which we called as a DNS zone. we use a terminology called as a DNS. The DNS zone is nothing but basically the DNS information for a specific domain. Okay, specific domain. Now this DSN application will create a DNS zone. Says that, hey, this application is going to maintain information for a domain called as acutelearn.com. The DNS zone is basically representing the domain name under which the DNS records are being basically present. Now this DNS application with a DNS zone maintains records. What records? There are some various records available, like we call an A or a host record. Host record. What is this basically like a mapping of this is something what we call as a mapping of a host name to a public IP to public IP address, public IP address. Now we say that, hey, www.acutelearn.com is available under 139.129.54.75.135. Now we are maintaining a record. Now this DNS application will allow us to maintain a DNS records. DNS records. Now we call host record mapping of a host name to public IP address. We know that the server is having a public IP address called as let's say, and 10 dot, I would say called as a 6.7.4.3, something like this. Then we see that, hey, in order to access this particular application, which is running on this particular server, which is having a public IP address, this can be accessed with a record called as a login dot this things with an IP address called as this one. Now this DNS application with an A record, it maintains what is the public IP address or an IP address of a specific server and the name of that particular server or an application or whatever it might be. So when we read it, we see called www.acutelearn.com. So when we try to access it in the background, it resolves to an IP address. It resolves to an IP address. So the DNS application will maintains a record called as this thing. Similarly, it maintains called as an AAA records. This is more basically called as a CNAME record, which is called as an alias, a duplicate name. So I have actual server name called as an server 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. Now I don't want to use an actual server name, but I want to give a duplicate name called as an photos, because it is easy to tell to the users that, hey, photos. So this our server is running a photos application. So it can be accessible like a photos.acutelearn.com. So this can be representing to a server 3344, which is holding an IP address called as like say server 3344 running called as 5.6.7.7 like that. Now what happens now? The DNS maintains an alias, a duplicate record, or basically alias name, which is called as like in photos, pointing to basically called as this particular one. So with that, what happens is we are hiding the actual name of the server, and we are giving in basically a user-friendly name to an application, to a server where the users can use it. And it can allow us to create some kind of DNS records called as an MX record, which is called as a mail exchanger record. Now this defines where is the mail server hosted for this domain, Now we can have our own mail server, or we might be using Microsoft 365 or using Zimbra or Yahoo or some. We see there are so many email providers across the globe. who are available. Now, where is the mail server hosted for this domain? So how does someone is sending a mail to training@acutelearn.com? How does it knows that where is the mail server available? On which particular server, the IP address, the mail server is available. Now, the MX record will tell that, okay, the DNS server says that, okay, there is an MX record. The email server for this domain is available on IP address called as a 10.10.10.10, like that. Then we use something called as an SPF records, which are being used in the spam protection. So this is basically restricting the or identification of your own mail server. Someone is basically trying to send an email by using your domain name and spamming it. Now this record will help to validate that whether the email has come from the actual server or in a different server. And we have a text records, which we call as in. Basically, this will maintain additional information. Maybe we use this a text record information to validate the domain names or to owner of this particular domain names. Like for it can be used for multi-purposes. Like this, there are basically some kind of a DNS records are being maintained by the DNS application. Now we use terminology called as a name server or a DNS server. It's simple that when we are using a name server or a DNS server, it means that it is basically a server which is running a DNS application and maintaining the DNS records information for a specific domain. We call that basically server as a DNS server or a name server. Now, if I go to the Google, so I'm saying called as an whois.net. Like this, there are so many vendors who provides, we can check. Now, what is the DNS server for a specific application? I'm giving acutelearn.com and enter it. Now see that for a domain called as an acutelearn.com, the domain, we see address, the name server. The IP address of this server is 97.74. The DNS server, which is maintaining the information, okay, which is owned by GoDaddy. So now for my domain called as an acutelearn.com, the DNS records are maintained on a server called as an 97.74.107.48. So if I go to the another domain called as an oracle.com, now we can see that for a oracle.com, there is a DNS server called as a 2.22.230.65, which is basically maintained by Akamai Technologies. And we see some other name servers, which are basically for this particular ones. Like this, for each and every domain, in the backend, there will be a domain name server, which is DNS server, or we call it as a name servers. So some people will call it as a name server, some people will call it as a DNS servers. Okay, this maintains information. Now, so now this DNS servers are maintaining the information. Now, To give an example, let's take an example of it. Now this is a DNS server, a DNS server by GoDaddy. GoDaddy. So which is maintaining the information for AcuteLearn.com. Now this is maintaining the information for AcuteLearn.com. But this is my network. This is my network or a PC or home. It could be a home network or could be something, or it could be a home or an office. Then home or an office, small office network. A small office network. Now when I type, so I'm using a laptop or some device on this particular machine. A laptop or something. Now from here, if I'm typing a www. I'm using a www.acutelearn.com. So how does this know that on which server it is available now? Now the DNS records are maintained in GoDaddy. But how does this particular machine and that network knows that the DNS server for this domain called as acutelearn.com is available on this particular IP? Now, I'm just a DNS server. I'll take an IP called as in some 7.8.8.6.5. Now, the question here is, and how does a server in the network or basically your home PC knows that the domain information for a domain called acutelearn.com is available at 7.8.6.5. Now, if it doesn't know it, then how it can reach the server? Now, when I say ping www.acutelearn.com, it is giving me some public IP address. Now, how does it knows the public IP address? So how does this DNS name system works of it? I will not talk very detailed, just to give you an idea. We'll talk about it. Now, the root DNS servers, there are something called as root DNS servers. And there are called as top level domain DNS servers. Then we call this a domain DNS servers. The domain represents here could be an AcuteLearn or could be Oracle or Microsoft like that. Now, basically the domain register, someone basically was maintaining this information now of it. Now, these are the three things which are available. Now, the DNS server, the top level DNS roots DNS servers, which is starting point of any DNS domain name system. Then we have a top level domain DNS servers. Then we have domain DNS servers. Now, when we register a domain, it's like GoDaddy or anything, they maintain the domain DNS servers. They maintain the domain DNS servers. So, in a home network or an office network, so there could be an option. You can have a DNS application installed on your office network, a DNS application within your office network DNS application. There could be a Windows server or a Linux server, which you can basically have a DNS application running within your own network. Or a router or a firewall or a router or some kind of a router, or I would say a firewall or a router is basically running in a DNS application. Now, could be within your organization, you might have a DNS or a firewall or something. Now you see in a home, we don't have any kind of servers in the home, but we still get the internet, which is that. Could be a router, which is your home router, running a DNS application. So your firewall or a router or some kind of a network device. Running the DNS application, what we call as a DNS, a simple service or something else. So either you can have a DNS server installed on a Windows machine, Linux machine, or maybe a DNS service which is running on firewall or router can be used. Now, this is my a firewall or a network device, which is having an IP address called as an 192.168.1.1. I'm just taking an example. Now the IP address of the firewall or your router in your network is 1.1. Now the computer, which is basically here within your network. So when we go to the TCP IP properties, we see DNS assignment automatic. So it has a DNS server IP address. Now when I go to the IP config /all, we would see a DNS servers. So each and every device, when we assign an IP address, we provide a DNS IP address. Now, this particular machine is pointing to a DNS server called as 192.168.1.1. So now we are pointing this server system or laptop or a device saying that, hey, the DNS is IP address is 192.168.1.1. Now this particular device should be able to reach the DNS server or an application or a device which is running the DNS application. Now what happens here now? So when I type www.acutelearn.com on this particular PC, it checks what is the DNS IP address. If it is already been cached, then it checks in the cache. If it is not there in the cache, then it checks what is the IP address of the DNS server. Now this PC will reach this device saying that, hey, I want to reach www.acutelearn.com, but I don't know what is the IP address of this particular server, because this particular device doesn't know what is the IP address of www.acutelearn.com. Now this particular device receives the DNS request. When it receives the DNS request, the DNS application which is running on this particular device checks that whether does it has information. Now it doesn't know the information because it is not maintaining the DNS records for a domain called as an acutelearn.com. Now it doesn't know. So what it does is that every DNS application will maintain the root DNS servers automatically. Now this will forward the request to the root DNS server saying that, hey, one of my user in the network or system in the network want to know the IP address of www.acutelearn.com, but I don't have information. Can you please guide me? Now the root DNS server sees which is the top level domain DNS server .com. The .com DNS server, which is the top .com DNS server, it tells that, okay, hey, you go and contact the DNS server called as an XYZ. Now this DNS server will contact this .com DNS server. Now the .com DNS server will maintain the information about the domain DNS server. Now When this device goes to this .com DNS server, it says that, hey, I want an information for a domain called as a www.acutelearn.com. Now, what this domain will does is that the top level domain sees that does it has information? It doesn't have information. It tells that please contact the domain DNS server on a public IP on IP called as an x.y.jet. Now, the root DNS server IP address could be a 4.2.1.1. The top level DNS server could be a 5.1.1. The DNS server, domain DNS server IP address could be 56.42.23.25. Now, what happens now? This top level DNS server will tell these device that you go and basically contact this domain DNS server, which is on this IP address called as an 56.42.23.54. Now, this device, the DNS application, will contact this DNS server. Now, this DNS server checks, does it maintaining the information for acutelearn.com? If yes, then it checks what information is required. Now, this server says that I need an IP address for www.acutelearn.com. Now, this DNS server checks under the DNS zone called as acutelearn.com. Is there a DNS record for www? Either a text record, either a host record or a CNAME record. Now, if there is a host record available in this DNS server, that www is being created to an IP address called as an 5.5. Something like an. Now, there is a DNS record www. Now, pointing to something called as an like 67.67.56.57. Now, this DNS server checks in its own database that whether it has a DNS record created for www. If it is, then what is the IP address of that? Then it passes that IP information to the device that, hey, a www.acutelearn.com is available on an IP address called as a 67.67.57. These things. Now, this firewall will forward this particular device that, hey, a www.acutelearn.com is available on an IP address called 67.67.57.45. You try to reach this IP address in order to access this application. So, the domain DNS server will maintain the DNS records. So if the record exists, it provides the information, IP address information, or whatever the text record information, whatever is being queried or asked. Then that is being forwarded to the actual device, which is basically requesting that information, and that device will take an action based on that information. Based on that information. This is how simple way it works. So even a Windows server which is running here, it could be running a DNS application will maintain the root DNS servers. A Linux server which is running a DNS application will maintain the root DNS servers. Will maintain the root DNS. Now, the devices within the network should have a proper DNS IP address. Now, this is the device which is running a DNS application. Now, if you provide an IP address called as a 1.2, but there is no DNS application running on this 1.2. Now, what happens when this device want to reach www.acutelearn.com? This device sees to reach the 1.2 DNS server, but there is no DNS application running on 1.2. Now, it cannot get the IP address. So, within the network, we need to clearly identify which is a server or a device or a network which is basically serving the DNS request, which is basically playing the role of a DNS proxy or running the DNS application. Running the DNS application. Now, that DNS application can checks within the database if it is available to provide. If not, it forward the request to the true DNS servers or top level domain servers or domain DNS servers and other things. It can basically get the information. So whenever we try to reach this one, okay. So like we would see called as an public DNS server. It tries to reach that. Now I'm trying to say called as an ping. I'm using called as an okay photos dot acutland.com. Sorry. It says called as an cannot find a host. It means that photos.acutland.com, there is no record, DNS record existing for this one called as a photos.acutland.com. That is the reason why it says, so the request, this server, the device has went to the DNS server application server, then it basically reached the domain DNS server. And this domain DNS server says that there is no DNS record called as in photos. And that is the reason why it's giving a message called as an host cannot find a host. Well, let's say if I go to the DNS, let me go to my DNS provider. Something. So this is in a GoDaddy DS. So I'll just have acutland.com domain. So I see called as a DNS. Okay. So I see there's no record called as in photos. And that is the reason why it says called as a, there is no host with this one. I'm trying to create a DNS record, a record. I'm saying called as in photos. I'm giving it called as in some 56.56. Some 43.56 and save it. Now I created a DNS record in the DNS server, which is my domain DNS server. I created DNS record in my domain DNS server. Now I'm going here. Let me flush the DNS. Basically, remove the caching. I'm saying photos dot still it is in cache. Now if I go to the another server and if I ping dot, let me see whether I save this record or not. That is more important. Yeah. Being photos.acutelearn.com. Now we see that it is giving an IP address called as 56.56.43.56. 46. So DNS plays a crucial role in the network, and it helps us in resolving an IP address of an FQDN name. So what IP address of the FQDN name? Okay. So this DNS servers basically domain registration where you've done. So this domain DNS servers will differ. So we go to the DNS servers in case of a public domains. So we go to the domain DNS servers, which has been provided by domain register, and we create a DNS records. And the DNS application, which is running on the local network, the DNS server, will basically forward the request to other DNS servers and get the information. We'll try to reach the domain DNS server and query the DNS records and provide this information of it. Okay, that is how basically the DNS domain name system works and how basically the DNS servers applications will work. So I've not talked about a specific DNS application like a Windows or these things. I just talked about how the name resolution works on the internet. Okay, and how this we called as an FQDN names or anything. This is just to a knowledge purpose that for a high level that how it can be. What is the DNS server application, how it works in the backend. Okay, so in the next lesson, we'll try to understand Azure DNS concept.